find it on some others. Hard to really put your finger on the guy, but I still couldn't figure out for the life of me whether it was really true that he made that prediction that night.
Well, he is an amazing character, and it's funny you said he was ahead of his time sometimes, because there's an interesting picture of him, and you've probably seen it before, on the Tremont Hotel, sitting there about 1865 without a hat, and everybody around him is like all these nice dressed up, and that's him there, and he's got like a profile. And I looked at that picture, and I go, my gosh, you know what he looks like? He looks just like Jim Croce, the singer, Time in a Bottle. And I'm thinking, what if Jim Croce was a time traveler? But that's a whole other story. But I put the pictures side by side, and they look exactly alike. But that's a different story.
Yeah. Well, one time in the Tribune archives, I did find an article about some kids down by the stockyards getting in trouble for messing with fireworks, and one of the kids' name was Leroy Brown. So it's on the south side of Chicago and everything, man.
Yeah, there you go.
Legends are true.
Yes. All right. There's one more interesting thing about it was one of the teenagers running for his life during the Great Fire was Eddie Foy, who lived in Chicago.
Yeah.
And he actually was, of course, starring as the head actor and comedian at the Iroquois Theater for Mr. Bluebeard, December 30th, 1903. And he was on stage when that theater, was an absolutely fireproof theater, burned down and killed over 600 people. He escaped with his life, but he actually remembers the Chicago fire as a young teenager. And I do recall, and maybe you can further clarify this, Adam. When the Iroquois Theater, which is the worst theater fire in the history of the United States, happened in December of 1903. One of the strange characters from the streets, supposedly like a vagrant, just ran there and tried to help people, and his last name was supposedly O'Leary. I don't know if that's true or not, but
no, I haven't heard that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's related to the O'Learys or what, but it's a connection. Go ahead.
Well, Big Jim O'Leary, Mrs. O'Leary's son, was certainly still around at the time.
Yes, Big Jim. Yes,
and Big Jim. He was a gambling kingpin.
Right. But she had five children. I don't know if 5 sons, but 5 children. And I don't know what happened to the other kids.
Yeah. Well, if you don't become a gambling kingpin in this town, nobody remembers you. So.
Yeah. Right.
Well, it's funny because one of the theories about the entire incident was actually traced back to possible gambling by Peg Leg and some other people, right? The whole barn story. Right. One of the stories was that they were gambling in the barn, correct? Yeah. There's also a couple of kids that were admitted later in life that they were in there and they knocked over a lantern or something. And other people have come forth and said this or said that. Peg Leg never admitted he was in there. He saw the barn burning and he ran over there, but he changed his story 3 or 4 times, like I said. And there's one man who wrote a very good book called The Great Chicago Fire and the Myth of Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, Richard Bales. And he got into the real estate records, and he really got in deep to it. And Peg Leg said he was leaning against the fence at so-and-so's property, and he saw the barn catch on fire. Well, this Mr. Bales said that couldn't be true, because at the time there was other houses right there where he supposedly were standing, and he couldn't see the barn. And so, anyway, Bales' thesis is Peg Leg O'Sullivan did it. So there you have it. I think it's entirely possible, but I like the comet theory as well. Adam, one of the things that I got to get into with you, since you're our resident ghost tour expert, is the water tower. Okay, so this is the one ghost story that I've heard possibly connected to the Chicago fire. Isn't there a story of a hanging man that's been seen there multiple times? I don't know for how long.
Well,
but
it's one of those things where I never actually meet anybody who claims to have seen it, but it has been going around a story that's been going around that you can see the silhouette of a man swinging back and forth in one of the windows. Supposedly a guy who was working in the building during the Great Chicago Fire saw the flames approaching and decided he would hang himself rather than be burned up. As far as we know, that didn't actually happen. There were a couple of suicides in the water tower some years later. But I've never been able to see anything in those windows personally.
Yeah, I was going to say, it would take an act of God to be able to see something in those, because from what I understand, it's like pitch dark, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't really see into them.
Right.
But yeah, that is the main Great Chicago Fire ghost story that I can really think of. There aren't as many as you would think. Yeah,
I mean, there may be some out there that you could probably possibly connect to it if you try hard enough, but I don't know any that are like...
Anytime you see a ghost and can't come up with a good backstory for it, that's a possibility.
Just say Chicago Fire. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So with the fellow who, I guess, predicted it, I mean, is this one of those situations where if you predict doom and gloom enough, eventually you might be right? I mean, that's kind of what comes to my mind when I hear the whole story.
Possibly. Well, also, everybody, if you look at newspapers from that day, they're full of ads for fire insurance. Everybody knew a fire was coming. Not to mention that the West Division fire would have been going on just a few blocks away from where he was at the time.
I was just gonna mention that the fire on October 7th, the night before, was happening the same time that he made that prediction. So I mean, it's he could have looked out the window and possibly saw it, and so there you have it there. Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, and we talked about this quickly before you guys came on, and John, of course, talked a little bit about it with Ray. But why was Chicago so prone to fires compared to other cities? I know that it was created from wood. Was it because it grew too fast, too quickly, and they just really didn't have any kind of fire ordinances back then?
I think it was kind of perfect storm of events at the time. The wooden city was kind of a problem. The droughts that year had been a problem. The fire department had depleted all their resources the night before in the fire in the West Division. So everything kind of happened at once. It could have been a lot worse. It could have spread to the south side too, but General Sheridan from the Civil War was on hand, blew up a bunch of buildings with dynamite. Right. I'd say he was an unsung hero, but he does have a street named after him. So.
Well, not only him, it was actually... Not only him, but it was also the alderman Hildreth, I believe his name was, that was doing that, and they encountered a lot of resistance. They show up at a place and say, "Hey, we're here to blow up your place." So, well, the fire hasn't come yet, but it's come. Yeah. They got a lot of resistance. Hildreth.
Okay, so since we're into the weird part of Chicago, I do have to ask. I know we've talked about some of the plausible theories. I got to ask about conspiracy theories. Adam, I'm sure you've heard some. John, you got to get into some too. I got to hear some of these that I have not heard about. There's a list out there, but I mean, who better to ask than you two?
Right. Well, there's the story that the Society Internationale was behind the whole fire. It was fairly prominent for a while there.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could just blame random anarchist groups or things like that.
There was also a theory. Supposedly, a couple of guys had come to Chicago to try to sell their wares of this fire preventive equipment. I don't know if you heard about this, Adam, and they got laughed at and ridiculed, and then these guys were so upset at the treatment that they got, they came back and started the fire and burned the city down.
That sounds like the kind of urban legend that goes around after every kind of disaster. I remember the one going around that Osama bin Laden had gone to an Ivy League school and someone said he had a small penis. And
no, I haven't heard that.
That was going around 2002 or so.
And another one was a divine judgment from God because of the sin that was in Chicago at the time. Of course, Chicago has always been a city like that, but at the time with all the brothels and prostitution and so forth, there's another accusation that was abundant in churches right after the fire.
Sure.
We heard that about Katrina too, didn't we? In New Orleans,
of course,
because there's it's a filthy city and it got what it deserved type of thing. Yeah,
just the kind of thing some people would say,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. One of the things I was wondering is those conspiracy theories, did those stretch out to the other cities that got hit with these fires? Because, there were 3 big fires, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah, actually,
not that I know
some
of.
people would consider that actually evidence that maybe there was some kind of plot going on, that more things happened at the same time.
They never found any ignition source or anything, though, obviously, for the time, right? Yeah,
no.
I didn't think so.
No.
No.
I don't know if you guys have read the original book that put forth the meteor proposition. There was a book called, I can't remember who wrote it offhand, it was called Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel, which also put
His name
forth
was
the proposition.
Ignatius Donnelly.
That's it, yeah. You can get it on Google Books. Yeah. It's really entertaining. I think it might be the first. He also said a meteor wiped out the lost continent of Atlantis, which I'm not sure anybody had actually thought was a real place before that.
Yeah, they thought this guy was a real wacko back then. We're talking about, I think it was approximately 1883 or something, just shortly after the fire. And he predicted this, that it was a cause of a comet. And he was either possibly way ahead of his time. Yeah, Ignatius Donnelly, the Age of Rock and Gravel or something like that.
Fire and Gravel.
I looked at it. Fire and Gravel.
It's a very entertaining book, but it's like listening to a guy with a tinfoil on his hat on his head for a few hours. But you can shut the book off,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where as long as you turn your brain off, if you think too hard, you're gonna have a bad time. But if you know what I mean? Yeah. Okay.
It came out in 1883. It came out in 1883. Ignatius Donnelly, Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel.
Yeah, highly entertaining book.
I gotta check that out. Okay, so since we're an hour and a half into the show, I guess now is a good time for me to kind of bring up the horrific aspects of it. And John talked about some earlier, and this is something that I don't think people think about when they think of a great fire like this. And most fires, people die of smoke inhalation. These were people catching on fire. Can you guys? And I don't say this for just for entertainment purposes, but I just want to convey how horrific this fire was. Can you talk about some of the individual stories that maybe stemmed from this whole thing? And like I said, John threw out some earlier, but if you guys have some that are particularly interesting / I don't know. I don't want to say grotesque, but you get my point.
Well, I can just quickly start off. It was extremely hot, and the wind was blowing about 30 miles an hour, and some people found it difficult to breathe, and they're trying to run, and there are some reports of some of the sand along Lake Michigan shore turning into rough glass, and there's something very unusual about this. And yes, some people were just one little girl ran by, her hair was on fire. And they noted that in a busy street as everybody's running with chaos and all the animals and people trying to grab merchandise. And but Adam, you can go ahead and offer anything else that you can think of.
Let me see, I'm working on. There's an article I'm looking for. I've got it on here someplace. Let me see. Okay, the New York Tribune published a whole thing called "A Graveyard on Fire." It's just a couple of paragraphs. I'll read it out. Talks about what is now Lincoln Park was the city cemetery. It was becoming Lincoln Park by then. So the correspondent of the New York Tribune describing the fire says, "This region over by the lake in the Great Lincoln Park seems to offer safety. So great a rush was made for the park, and the refugees made themselves comfortable in the delusion of security. After ravaging the limits of the city with the wind dead against it, the fire caught the dried grasses that ran along the fences, and in a moment covered the burning glory of the Catholic cemetery and the grassy stretches of the great park. The marbles over the graves cracked and baked and fell in glowing embers on the hot turf. Flames shot up from the resting places of the dead, and the living fugitives, screaming with horror, made for a moment the ghastliest spectacle that ever fell upon living eyes. The receiving vault, the place where they stashed bodies, solidly built and shrouded in foliage, fell under the terrific flame, and the dead burst from their coffins as the fire tore through the walls of the frightful charnel house. In the broad light of today, the place is the most ghastly I ever saw, not even Cold Harbor exceeding it in awful suggestiveness. Above the graves, charred stones stand the grim sentinels of the dead, no more memorials of anything but disaster. Every inscription has disappeared, and even the dead are robbed by the flames.
Yep, and there were